Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this was kind of a strange week. The schedule wound up reshuffled a little bit. Got an odd selection of projects and not a lot of time to get to everything, especially given that my mid-year review of the best albums and songs of 2020 thus far just dropped, which I hope you all check out when you get a chance. Put a lot of work into that. But in the meantime, alright, here we go on the Pulse. So we've got 6 projects on the docket this week, so let's start off with, from Loviet, Everyone Knows the Thrill When It's Over. Alright, let's start with this debut EP from this Toronto-based artist, where it looks like she's going for some anthemic, obviously 80s-inspired, huge-feeling synth-pop textures that are normally a pretty easy sell for me. And I do think there's some real potential here. The Dua Lipa influence on the texture and groove, it's pretty obvious, but I like the sharper, new wave rollick in the guitar lines that do contain some real momentum. And while there are some points that feel a bit clumsy, I would argue 2 out of the 3 songs struggle to get going effectively, I'd also say that Loviet is a pretty good singer, and I like the mini arc of this EP, where it's very clear she knows better than to chase the faux enlightened heartbreaker, but she does it anyway, and she rides out the thrilling melodrama to an intentionally inconclusive ending. Now again, I got some quibbles with this. I think emphasizing how young and lacking culpability for what she does on the final song kind of cheapens the arc a little bit, and this is absolutely a sound and material where I'd like to hear a little bit more to differentiate her from her influences, especially in a scene like this that's going to get oversaturated very fast. But you know what? For a likable and catchy, pretty short pop EP, it's pretty good. 7 out of 10, if you're curious. Give it a chance. Next up, from Nuvolascura, As We Suffer from Memory and Imagination. Do any of you remember what I said about Screamo as a subgenre a couple months back? Yeah, tack on descriptors like emo violence, and we get into even more frenetic, wild territory, which gives us this relatively new act, Nuvolascura, who dropped their debut last year. And while it was certainly intense for its sub-20-minute runtime, I can't say I was wowed by it. It's not my genre, and there's not much in the way of dynamics or standout tunes or progression that really grip me. Now, circling around for their album this year, well, it's a bit more distinctive in that the songs seem to have a bit more differentiation and punch, and the loud, soft dynamic is fleshed out a bit more. I will say the group can ease back and show off some of the more impressive guitar work, especially on the slower instrumentals, but with the right complement on the faster Screamo moments, as there are some pretty impressive riffs here, opposite some of the more technical drum lines that are impressive. But again, this is another project where nothing really has enough room to breathe, and good ideas are discarded as quickly as they are approached. Now, there's a tremolo passage in the guitars on Pixel Vision Anxiety that sounded really cool for a couple of seconds at the end of the song that got it. They could have done with more to develop it. And yes, I get the feeling the haphazard lack of structure with the ideas whirling past, it is on purpose, used to highlight our frontwoman's panicked, visceral screams of anxiety and isolation, and trying to find some moment of life amidst a whirl of prescription medication and numb midpoints. But with the vocals so buried and lacking any sort of change-up and rarely any poetry that feels distinct, the formless songs here run together even more. Again, I would struggle to call this bad. This is not a subgenre music that's for me, and I'm sure the slapdash visceral appeal will hit more powerfully for other audiences, as I know it does fit the thematic point. But at the end of the day, this suffering scream did not echo for as long as I was hoping, so strong 5 out of 10. Again, if you're a Screamo fan, you'll probably find something to like, but it did very little for me. Next up, from Creature, Cathedra. Alright, a one-man progressive black metal project with a symphonic twist and no notable connections to rampant shittiness. That's encouraging, especially for an act with such a frustratingly common name to Google. And thus getting into the actual music, well, outside of some really messy production early on and blending in the prog elements, especially those horns, I was generally amenable to this sort of frenetic and melodic black metal that only picked up more warped and interesting elements on their second album that play into more of a self-destructive bent. And now here... oh, look, I don't want to call this a backslide, but I really wanted to like this a lot more than I do. For one, the horns are back to flesh out more of the melodies, and they're often as flat and out of place as on their debut, blending into the often excellent guitar work, not helped by the same sort of weird weightlessness and airless feeling to a lot of the mastering. Nothing much has a space to breathe, and while you can tell the melodies are as robust and technical as ever, I'm left thinking that with actually writing transitions or hooks or giving these tunes just proper space or even just helping the bass lines and the kick drum have a little bit more definition could make this project a lot more compelling or impactful, or at least help the compositional diversions feel kind of less scattered. Now, I will say while this project can start to run together, it does have its distinctive moments. The problem is that more of those moments feel even more out of place, like the rap breakdown on Atlantis that doesn't match or blend with anything. In fact, the final few songs of this project really do turn into a slog, because while I can appreciate the more ragged and dynamic riffs throughout some of the furious midsection, 2 10-plus minute tracks without a really striking melodic motif, they don't help whatsoever. And unfortunately, from what I could translate from the lyrics in French, I'd argue they don't help much either. The title of the album refers to the concept of papal infallibility, which implies that anything the Pope might say from his seat is church-approved doctrine, where this album's scattered stories show the consistent and often complete collapse of that sort of infallible authority because, well, humans are fallible, and pride cometh before the fall, which is why you get stories like of Atlantis, and the reference very early on to the Sword of Damocles. So, you know what, if you're a classics nerd looking for some pretty damn complex, but also pretty depressing black metal, I will say Creature delivered that, but unlike, say, the Spectral Lore Mare Cognitum split from earlier in the year, a lot of the production, the compositions, and the writing, they do not justify the bloat here. So I hate to say it, but strong 5 out of 10, another project I wish I liked more, but it really became a chore. Just saying. Next up from Tenille Townes, The Lemonade Stand.
And why can't you stop a car from crashing? Forgive me, I'm just asking.
So we've got some Canadian country here, and I'll admit I've been hearing about Tenille Townes for a little bit now, and not just because she was cutting a few albums back in 2011 and 2013 when she was a teenager. No, a lot more of her buzz in recent years has come from signing to Columbia Nashville, touring with Miranda Lambert and Little Big Town, and getting some legit groundswell on the Canadian country charts with her new singles. All of which may have been released a little bit too early to properly push this album, but okay, what did we get with it? Well, we got a lot of pop country, and the second I started hearing the slightly overemphasized and blocky percussion, and some of the leads that felt a little bit too sharply textured in the mix, I didn't even have to look up that Jay Joyce produced this. Like Dave Cobb, he's got a sound to his production that can overpower the artist with whom he works. Now, you know what, to Tenille Townes' credit, her sharper, Elle King-esque vocal timbre, it's actually a better fit for Joyce than when he worked with Miranda Lambert, and you can tell that with the more obvious pop pivots on a fair few songs, especially on the back half, where I gotta say it, some of the synthetic layers, the blocky percussion, and the increasingly gummy grooves, they started actively becoming obtrusive, but there is still quality here. White Horse, Lighthouse, and Jersey on the Wall, I'm Just Asking, they're all great songs in the midsection, the last of which is featuring a premise on meeting God in the afterlife and heaven that Townes actually repeats on When I Meet My Maker to somewhat lesser effect, and the hooks are genuinely organic, they flow pretty well, and in comparison with a lot of the pop country that I've covered this year, this is an album that actually has momentum and doesn't get bogged down in some sleepier tones, so I can hear this being a fair bit more accessible. That being said, Townes' rougher delivery and tendency to over-sing a little bit, that does come through in the ballads, and this album definitely loses a lot of steam by the end. A lot of folks highlight Somebody's Daughter as a late album highlight, but I gotta admit and I'm kind of lukewarm on it, mostly because its view on helping the homeless or just being aware of them feels more built on sympathy than any sense of outright altruism, and with moments that can feel a little bit more basic and less distinctive in the writing with some questionable production. You know what? In a year stuffed full of women in pop country, it's a strong 6 out of 10. Good debut, not a great one. Next up from Arca, Kick Eye. I have been frustrated with Arca for years now. Hell, that's been nearly verbatim in how I opened my last review of her work. I mean, I think she's a fascinating producer with odd taste in texture and melodic structure, but the last project of hers I found really interesting was 2015's Monster, and ever since then she's made more connections, she's broken through, she's added more vocals, she's racked up notable production credits, and has seemed to be going in a bit more of an accessible direction. Which, you know what, does not have to be a bad thing. She's working with Sophie, Rosalia, Bjork, that gave me a lot of hope for this, and thus I'm kind of in a bit of a weird spot with this album, because it feels halfway between the abrasive, expansive, experimental electronics that she started with, and slightly more conventional indie pop structures, but also trying a bit of a half measure and trying to split the difference between the two for more of a dance floor vibe. Now again, maybe it's just becoming a little bit more accustomed to the squeaking, unstable synths, the percussion that's either sandy and kind of shuddering, or like a cacophonous blast of machine gun fire, sometimes with literal gunshot samples, but it always feels intensely textured, and the increasing presence of Sophie's approach to bubblegum bass and a lot of electro pop. I'm a little bit more amenable to the overall sound than I used to be like 4 or 5 years ago, especially in a pop context, but I also won't deny that the goddamn chipmunk vocals really test my patience every single time. They're all over this album, and it's a real disappointment that after following Afterwards with Bjork, Watch with Shy Girl, and especially the punishing KOK with Rosalia, we get Rip the Slit. In my opinion, easily the most grating track here. Now, thankfully the album turns around with its pretty strong closer, No Queda Nada, but I'm left with the feeling that we haven't quite got the transcendent potential of Arca's production that I first glimpsed on Monster, at least not consistently. And it actually seems like some critics are starting to agree and are pointing to the underwritten lyrics and the vocals as something of a factor. I mean, like with the self-titled album, I'm not gonna say the vocals elevate the material, but I will say she's gotten more expressive on this project, even if the frequent evocation of martial imagery and some tones might not be the best of options given how much of Arca's family connections have been exposed in recent years. It's kind of an odd complexifier to her trans narrative I wish was given more than just passing touches, especially as otherwise there are a lot more trans and non-binary and genderqueer musicians who can give a lot more in the lyrical department that I actually have covered and I like a fair bit more. But that being said, I would probably call this Arca's best and absolutely most accessible project since Monster, so I just wish I'm a little warmer on it. In other words, extremely strong 6 out of 10. I will say this is worth hearing. And finally, from HAIM, Women in Music, Part 3. So look, I feel a bit like I've been on the outside looking in on HAIM throughout their career. I've liked their singles, a few scattered songs, but as a whole the albums have felt overproduced in weird spots, really scattershot, and generally a lot less impactful than I've been hoping for. It's one of those frustrating cases where I get all the critical acclaim as I hear what works on the songs I like, but not really holistically, or for more than just a couple of songs. So coming off a sophomore slump in 2017, I was curious where the hell they were going to take this, and for the life of me, I have no idea why this is getting so much critical acclaim. Well, you know what, actually, let me take a step back with that, because I'd argue it is very critic-friendly to a certain audience. Maybe not as packed with the same hooks as their debut, or such a forgettable slog as their sophomore album, but there's enough of a Californicated veneer slathered over the overproduced overproduced soft rock with enough exposed edges and 90s inspired rough patches to appear kind of experimental. I mean, there are even attempts at wonky G-funk on 3 AM or some Sublime-esque reggae on Another Try, until you realize how much of their grooves, punch, and robust harmonies in the vocals they traded away for that along the way, instead picking up some truly ugly, weedy guitar tones without much body or blending into the bass, and blocky, often sterile and programmed percussion. Now, I actually looked up the production team, and along with Tenille HAIM, we have Ariel Rekshade and Rostam Bakmanglij, both names most well known for their connections with Vampire Weekend. And then my big problem with this album snapped into focus, because it's the same damn issue I've had with that overrated band for years now. If your production is more ornamental than supportive, and actively distracts from your strongest elements, which for Vampire Weekend was either lyrics or pure composition, but for HAIM it's definitely the latter, then the music just will not hit the same for me. Hell, as much as I was ragging on Jay Joyce's production earlier, for the most part he gets to preserve the foundational groove, he understands the artist's strengths, and he gave Tenille Townes a lot of room to cut loose. Whereas here, well, what's worse is that it can kind of hurt some of the writing. HAIM has always gotten a lot of praise for pretty basic, straightforward lyrics that can nevertheless carry more depth courtesy of their delivery. And you know what, to their credit, there's some decent pop storytelling in a lot of these tunes. Rarely unique outside of some very welcome callouts of guys in their lives with fragile ego, or in the music industry who presume too much, like on The Steps and Man from the Magazine. But there's a complexity in how often and why they will give those men more chances. And with more organic blending, I could see these songs kind of really working. I could hear this maybe being great for me. But when you're actively distracting from the finer details with clunkier layers, sometimes even around the vocals, and then mixing where to preserve the band's loose appeal, we get either weird muddiness, even on some of the acoustic songs, or patches where the ugly guitar tones just hang exposed. Some of that implied depth just does not translate for me. And you know what, if the ugliness was part of the point, I'd be receptive, except it's not really framed like that. More just the cast-offs of a very specific production tone that was endemic in late 2000s, early 2010s indie pop and rock that I found so tepid when I ranted about Bombay Bicycle Club nearly 6 months ago. This was all over the critical acclaim set. Hell, when HAIM got more raw and experimental with all the soloing and the screams and all that I ever wanted, they easily made one of their most striking and potent songs to date, and it's easily one of the best songs here. But I've already seen folks for which that lukewarm sound, it's nostalgic, it puts them in a very specific, very white hipster comfort zone. I'm not going to begrudge anybody that feeling. I had acts on my mid-year list that touched on a very similar zone, albeit with different genres. Again, maybe just not for me. But again, it's frustrating because there's some really damn solid composition spoiled by production and presentation that just doesn't work for me. So for me, 6 out of 10, it's not bad, but not great either. But you know what? It's an easy band for you to say that you like. So, hell, if you want that, have a blast. Presuming you just don't unironically enjoy it, and have a blast with that too. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can't imagine how this review will be controversial, but the comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get some albums on my schedule going forward, for something I might want to cover in the second half of the year, link to my Patreon is right over there. And again, if it's hard times for everybody, they're under no obligation to help contribute there, but if you want to, the option is available. I'll be fine regardless. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.